So thank you all for being here with us tonight. Jim has been referred to as Indiana's preeminent historic preservation architect, and his long career has affected the streetscapes of Indianapolis and many other places. I will highlight many of these projects, as well as how Jim's work illustrates the many roles of an architect. Before we start, I want to recognize that I would not be able to give this presentation without the help of Marjorie, who supplied stories and pictures, Jason Shelley, who provided photos and transcripts of oral history interviews he conducted with Jim, which allowed me to use some of Jim's own words, and Ken Riemenschneider and Laura Kuhns, who spent time to give details about Jim's work. Also, Marjorie emphasized that Jim would not want to take sole credit for a project and that the practice of architecture required teamwork. Therefore, when talking about specific projects, I include the name of the firm he worked with to recognize the efforts of all the others involved. So we start with how Jim came to the field of architecture. He went to Aquinas High School in Columbus, Ohio. Jim's father drove him to school on his way to work. So after school, Jim would go to the library to do his homework. He enjoyed looking at the pictures of buildings and books, which spurred his interest in architecture. This collegiate Gothic building was his high school library, which also seems inspiring. Jim began college at the University of Cincinnati, studying architecture. In 1962, he joined the National Guard and trained as a combat engineer at Fort Leonard Wood. In 1964, he returned to study architecture at the Ohio State University and graduated in 1967 with a 5-year architecture degree. Jim was in school when the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act was passed, creating the National Register of Historic Places and formalizing and professionalizing preservation of historic buildings. At the same time, the School of Architecture at OSU taught design in the modern style. In one class, Jim designed a building with some traditional details and was told, "We don't do that here." On the other hand, Jim recalled the series of history of architecture courses taught by Perry Borchers, saying that we were required to provide a sketch every Monday morning on whatever subject we were discussing. That gave me a lot of hands-on experience and a critical eye for analysis of every period and style of architecture. That series really fostered my love of preservation and historic architecture. Jim's career illustrates how he practiced his love for historic preservation and his ability to adapt structures with an eye for the modern. Two important things happened in 1965. First, Jim and Marjorie married. Marjorie was not only his wife, but his cheerleader and partner in promoting his career. When Jim decided to open his own firm, Marjorie joined him in the business, taking on the role of managing partner. The other important event of 1965 was that Jim met Ewing Miller. As Jim recalled, the first time I met Ewing was when he came as a guest lecturer at OSU. The title of Ewing's lecture was Innovations in Practice, such as offset printing of construction documents and applying behavioral science to architecture. It was really cutting edge. After the lecture, I got a chance to meet him, and I thought to myself, this is the kind of architect I want to be, an innovator, thoughtful, always nattily dressed. Jim worked for 2 firms in Columbus after he graduated from OSU. His first real project was converting an old industrial building to a market and delicatessen in German Village. I don't have a picture of the project, but this is the home where Jim and Marjorie lived. Jim recalled that his passion for preservation really grew after working on this project. In 1971, he took a job as Director of Architecture for Modular Housing Systems in Northumberland, Pennsylvania. Jim said his motivation for taking the job was that he was intrigued by the creative possibilities of these modular homes. So for 2 years, we built homes all over the East Coast. We will see how this experience became useful in future projects. As Jim became a partner at Green, Diamond, and Kienle Architects in Silver Spring, Maryland in 1973. The most significant project Jim worked on was the Silver Spring Library. You can see that it is designed in a 1970s modern style. In 1975, Jim and Ewing reconnected, and Jim and Marjorie were ready to move back to the Midwest. Jim joined Ewing's firm, Arconics, and jumped into historic preservation early on with his own home in Lockerbie. The project was important, not only for the Kienle family, but for a few other reasons. Lockerbie was the first designated historic district for the city. In 1976, when Jim and Marjorie were moving there, only a few houses had begun restoration, and the district was punctuated with trash-filled empty lots and boarded-up buildings. Jim and Marjorie were the first to receive backing from a financial institution to purchase and rehabilitate a historic house as a single project in the blighted area. They moved this 1872 Carpenter Gothic house from 916 Broadway in Chatham Arch to its current site. And if you look in the lower edge of this picture right here, you can see Jim supervising. They were able to return the house to its original appearance by removing inappropriate modernizations using old photographs to replicate fabric that was lost due to neglect. Jim and Marjorie were undaunted about the neighborhood because they had seen the revitalization of German Village in Columbus and Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and they knew it would eventually happen in Lockerbie. Jim recalled the experience, saying, "I was a young architect with limited means, so we did much of the restoration ourselves." He also said that he liked doing his own design work because it let him follow his own vision. But it would be a mistake to think he had no client. Jim said, "You still have a client when you are married, and I had to consider Marjorie's opinions and needs in my designs." When Jim began practicing in Indianapolis in 1975, the downtown was beginning a resurgence architecturally. Bill Hudnut was mayor at the time and noted that the years during his reign will be remembered for the effort that was made to create a new city center. Historic preservation became the means to maintain the city's unique identity. The book you see here was published in 1975 and could be considered the baseline for Jim's work. Nathaniel Owings commented in the book about the future of Indianapolis architecture, saying, "It would be far better if the architect were less of an artist and more of an orchestra leader. And there is a greater need than ever before for the orchestration of great civic development." We will also see how Jim acted as one of the conductors in the revitalization of downtown Indianapolis and other places. The 1984 Circle Theater restoration was one of Jim's favorite projects and an accomplishment he was most proud of. The theater narrowly avoided being demolished by the owner, and by making it the home of the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra, it became part of the new downtown vitality, along with the Indiana Repertory Theater, Hoosier Dome, and Convention Center. Restaurants began to open up downtown in response to the area becoming a place to be after work hours and on the weekends. Jim talked about the difficulties of changing a theater to a symphonic hall, requiring the surgical removal of portions of the proscenium arch to meet orchestra performance requirements. The major restoration elements included the ornamental ironwork, the terracotta facade, and the mirrored side boxes. Jim said, "In a job like this, everything depends on special care. This includes the flexibility to handle surprises, like tearing down a wall and discovering that what you expected to find is not there." Jim and Arconics team members joined into the revitalization of historic resources downtown and saved many of these from destruction, including the Indiana Theater pictured here, showing its original proscenium arch. Strategies for preservation included feasibility studies, recommending new uses for historic structures, urging owners to get their buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and finding ways to adapt the 19th century buildings to modern day needs. Jim and his team conducted a master plan for the theater in which they recommended converting it for the new home of the Indiana Repertory Theater. Jim chaired a committee on urban design to study the Lockfield Gardens apartments in order to convince the city and IUPUI to save them. The committee focused attention on the complex's significance as a prominent neighborhood of the African American community, and that it was one of the best examples of 1930s Art Deco architecture in Indianapolis. In the end, half of the 274-unit complex was saved for later adaptation into student housing and retail use. For the Omega Communications Building at 29 East Maryland, Jim developed a feasibility study and got the building listed on the National Register of Historic Places. His work became an example of how a typical 19th century building could be adapted for a high-tech contemporary use. The Morrison Opera Place rehabilitation was a watershed project. A previous feasibility study recommended demolishing the building, but Jim's team developed a plan that showed, although the building was functionally outdated, it could be restored to provide excellent market rate office and commercial space. The original storefront had been obliterated, as you see on the left, so a new storefront was designed to reflect the styles prevalent at the time it was built. In 1983, the Indianapolis Glove Company was still operating out of their plant in Lockerbie. Interest arose for residential and commercial development in the area. So Jim Ewing and 7 others worked together, acting as architect and also developing partners, who undertook the project to develop the factory into 62 condominium units and 58 new townhouses. The Lockerbie Glove Factory project was the first reuse of an industrial building for residential in downtown. Ewing Miller lured Jim to Indianapolis to work on the state complex master plan, and Jim's work with the state spanned over 40 years. This is what the Capitol complex looked like in the early 1980s. Goals for the study were to assess the existing buildings, to look at space and parking needs for the next 10 years, and to develop areas for long-term growth for the next 50 years, including a new state office building. The plan developed a strategy to eliminate all of the surface parking from the Capitol complex and to remove the railroad tracks that bisected the campus. In order to get a cohesive design for the area, Jim and Ewing stepped up to create a collaborative environment among design professionals. In the 1980s, the State Office Building Commission decided to engage 6 Indianapolis lead design firms to develop a unified government center. However, egos were in play and tensions arose between design teams. Jim and Ewing recognized the toxic nature of this atmosphere, so they proposed a road trip to Washington, D.C. for all 6 firms' principals and project managers to evaluate the federal buildings and the spaces in between. The trip generated lively and spirited discussions without any tension or challenging egos. The Washington trip precipitated a respectful and collaborative working environment among the firms, one of more cooperation and collegiality. This is a vintage postcard of the State Office Building built in the 1960s. You can see how it dwarfs the State House. According to Jim, the original thought was to build another 14-story office structure like the one built in 1960. The team took a whole different approach because building another building of that scale on the site would have obscured the view of the Capitol. The team made the building only 5 stories, which is why it fills the whole site here, creating a sightline to the Capitol Dome The project reinstated Market Street, which meant that there was no backside of either building, and allowing vehicular access from the west to be able to drop people off, which you can't do now. The State Library and employment buildings were integrated with an underground service plaza under Market Street and a new tunnel built to the east, which connects to the Capitol building all the way to the corner of Illinois and Washington Street. Jim said that the Indiana Government Center South was a close second as a favorite project. He recalled working with a terrific team and how the design of the new building reflected its historic context. This was accomplished by using limestone, like on the State House, and simplifying the design so it would not compete with the details of the Capitol building. Jim also explained the extensive porches this way. The desire to make the government more accessible, not to have everything by a single core of elevators, drove the design. The idea was that more entries into the building make those government agencies more accessible. Although this concept no longer is viable because of security concerns, the porches continue to provide great shelter, and you see people use them. Besides, a porch fits an Indiana image. Long halls in the building duplicate the atrium and halls in the State House. The larger picture is the hallway to the conference area on the north side of the building, and the lower left is a photo of a fourth floor hallway in the State House. There are now two signs on the furthermost pillars in the main picture. One of with the names of all the government officials involved in the project, and another with the names of members of the design team. Marjorie told me that the design team sign originally was much smaller and listed only a few names and firms. Jim insisted that more people needed to be included on the sign, so now it looks like this. Jim later consulted on additional projects in the State House. In 2004, he worked with engineers to integrate an HVAC system in the building in a manner sensitive to the original historic fabric. He also worked on the restoration of the dome and redesign of the west entrance. Jim also was involved in the restoration of the judicial areas of the State House, including upgrading the historic light fixtures, like the central chandelier in the courtroom, and the restoration of the original and richer color palettes in the Supreme Court room and in the law library shown here. Jim talked about Ewing's desire to get the state government more connected to the city by increasing physical access. Jim led the Washington Street Transit Mall study, which gathered city planners, state and local transportation officials, and Circle Center Mall designers. Existing historic structures along Washington Street were carefully assessed, and block by block layouts illustrated the integration of the transit mall to ensure adequate traffic and pedestrian service levels downtown. You can see a bus shelter structure in the lower left. Perhaps this was the beginning of the discussion that led to the Julia Carson Transit Center that now stands by the City County building. Jim's involvement with Circle Center Mall came from a preservation perspective, showing that a contemporary mall could be situated in downtown without destroying the historic fabric. The building was adapted to retail and government office uses. This project reused some of the last remaining historic structures along Washington Street. To the west on Washington Street, Jim was principal in charge for the master plan and design services for the White River State Park development. The first phase in implementing the plan was called Capital City Landing and extended the canal walk from West Street to the White River and converted the old Washington Street Bridge into a pedestrian walk, providing links to the Indianapolis Zoo and the White River Gardens. Jim, working along with Ken Riemenschneider, was involved in creating new office parks in the Castleton area. Castleton Mall opened in 1972, and demand for more suburban office space arose. The Castle Creek Corporate Park project began in 1978, with Jim serving as the project design principal for a master plan for 140 acres north of 86th Street behind Castleton Mall, and he was later the architect for 4 office buildings. Focus for the buildings included designing them to create and reinforce an identifiable image for the total development, while allowing variety in the individual buildings. In 1989, Jim and Ken worked together on the Allison Point Master Plan. The property is in a marshy area near the White River, west of Allisonville Road and south of 465, making it a challenging area to design a high-profile commercial area, especially due to the fact that there was very limited frontage for the property along Allisonville Road and 82nd Street. The design solution involved the redevelopment of the floodplain area to create a lake and preservation of the wooded areas in high elevations. The solution for creating visibility for the complex was to have the buildings face 465. Arconics merged with HNTB in 1984, giving Jim opportunities outside of Indiana. Jim made connections in Kentucky, starting with the Kentucky State Capitol Master Plan. The plan mirrored what he had done on the Indiana State Capitol Plan, providing a direction in the restoration and creation of new additions to the Capitol and Capitol Annex. In 2002, Jim and the team did the bricks and mortar work recommended in the plan. And since the project was initiated shortly after the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon and World Trade Center, the team needed to come up with a new approach for heightened security while protecting the historic fabric of the building. Jim presented the project at the 2002 National Park Service Conference in Washington, D.C., in a session titled Security for Historic Public Structures. Jim worked on some recognizable projects in Carmel. He was the principal in charge for the new City Hall, Police Headquarters, Central Fire Station, and Civic Square Commons study. The city wanted the structures to be designed in the Georgian federal style. Jim spent the time to educate the city officials about the elements of the style and the creation of buildings with the appropriate scale, massing, detail, materials, and landscaping. Jim was also involved in the master plan for the village of West Clay, designing a new town using the principles of new urbanism, which means that the layout included mixed-use buildings, community meeting space, walkability, natural features, open space, and varying architectural styles. The resulting village refers back to the Hoosier environment of the 19th century. The first phase of the project was the development of the entry corridor, Broad Street, and Jim designed 14 houses representing architectural styles found in Indiana between 1820 and 1885. Jim was involved in the reuse of several train depots. His first was the Big Four Depot in Lafayette, where he completed a feasibility study to investigate the possible marketable uses and viable preservation options for the depot. Jim and his team created a solution which included moving the depot 4 blocks to a site overlooking the Wabash River, adjacent to the old Main Street Bridge, which was configured as a park and recreation space. The restored building kept its original function as an intermodal transportation center. For the L&N Depot project in Bowling Green, Kentucky, Jim convinced community groups that a library was a viable reuse strategy for the structure. The exterior of this classical revival structure was restored, and the interior and contemporary addition were adapted for the library, a community activity center, and public service offices. In 1999, Jim began work in West Virginia with a feasibility study for the B&O Railroad Station in Grafton. Jim and his team were hired by the Vandalia Heritage Foundation, a nonprofit group organized to encourage economic development and revitalization through historic preservation. The B&O Railroad Study was the first of a long list of projects that describes Jim's way of interacting with communities and clients. According to Laura Kuhns, when interviewing firms, Jim and his team not only showed that they had the architectural, engineering, and historic preservation experience, but Jim also impressed upon her that he understood people and how preservation spurred economic development. Jim's role as HNTB's historic preservation guru led to some high-profile national projects. In 1991, Jim prepared a design study for the old executive office building to develop options for rehabilitation, incorporation of central mechanical and electrical systems, and a site analysis for a new diplomatic reception area between the building and the west wing of the White House. Jim also served as the historic preservation technical consultant on appropriate methods for the restoration of the Lincoln Memorial. In 2003, HNTB shifted their architectural practice to Kansas City and closed the architectural office in Indianapolis. Jim commented about the closing, saying, "While I could have retired, I wasn't ready. I just love what I do too much. So I founded my own boutique firm, James T. Kienle and Associates." Jim became partner in charge and Marjorie managing partner. Jim was chosen as the design leader for the Mary Switzer Building GSA Design Excellence Project in Washington, D.C. The Design Excellence Program sets criteria for GSA's selection of the most appropriate architects and integrated design teams for commissions, meaning that the GSA chose Jim and not HNTB. This is the project that gave Jim the confidence to start his own firm. Jim worked on additional projects with Vandalia Heritage in West Virginia, many of which involved creating affordable housing and upgrading housing stock in the Fairmont area. Jim assembled a team and sat down with the foundation for a brainstorming session about housing in the area, resulting in the creation of an urban renewal authority to help develop blighted areas of the city. Jim was hired to design infill houses to complement the historic neighborhood. The goal was to fill the scattered sites and get people excited about living downtown again. Jim created 7 different designs that illustrated appropriate design vocabulary for the historic neighborhood, and his experience in industrialized housing fostered designs that could be built using either modular or standard construction. Jim created mixed-use development plans for several buildings in West Virginia, including the historic Waldo Hotel in Clarksburg. Jim also worked on a master plan for the redevelopment of the historic downtown in Fairmont. Why did Vandalia Heritage continue to work with Jim again and again? According to Laura Kuhns, the organization returned to Jim not only because of his professional skills and architectural knowledge, but because of the level of service he provided. He made himself available to provide technical assistance for other projects and interacted with authorities, working with them to find compromises needed to bring the projects to fruition. She said that Jim could look at a building and immediately diagnose what needed to be done. Back in Indianapolis, Jim was involved in new multifamily projects, some built, some not. This is a photo of one that was built, the Woodmont condominiums. They are in the Arden area and are a cluster of 6 buildings with 4 luxury condos each. The setting is a beautiful wooded area adjacent to the White River. Jim also worked on single-family homes. At Traders Point Farm, the house was designed to blend with nature from the way it is situated on the lot. Jim's work at Traders Point also extended to the creamery. He clearly had no qualms about moving buildings. However, for this project, he had 4 historic barns disassembled, moved to the farm, and reconstructed to provide the foundational structures for the dairy. Jim enjoyed theater projects and described his feelings this way. The thing about theaters, they are an embodiment of local culture. People have incredible memories about these local theaters. My first date, my birthday, all kinds of cultural memories associated with those theaters. It's a tragedy when you lose them. One of the first he worked on was a restoration assessment of the Rivoli Theater that included suggestions for a range of reuse options as a catalyst for the 10th Street corridor revitalization. The Lerner Theater project began with a feasibility study and eventually the restoration of this classical revival vaudeville house in Elkhart's historic downtown. The restoration was completed and a new addition built that provided conference and event space. Jim commented that the team was not only able to bring it back to its original glory, but that it has also been a part of the revival effort for the city. In 2009, Jim and Marjorie sold the practice to Moody Nolan. Jim recalled that Moody Nolan wanted to expand its preservation practice. And he said, "That's been my love and passion for so many years. I didn't want to pass up the opportunity. I'm so glad I said yes to the offer because it's given me a chance to work on one of my favorite projects of my career, the restoration of the Memorial Union at the University of Wisconsin, pictured here." Don't worry, all you Indiana fans. Jim also worked on the Alumni Hall and Solarium renovation, part of the IU Memorial Union. Jim's work in Franklin, Indiana began with the Artcraft Theater study in 2007 and is another illustration of the depth of effect of Jim's work on a community. The study served as the basis of fundraising for the restoration. The focal point for the community was, of course, the marquee restoration. Jim then partnered with Ken Riemenschneider on the 2009 Franklin Master Plan. While Ken focused on the economic and external areas for improvement, Jim's focus was on the preservation of the buildings, as well as choosing those which would serve as catalyst projects for the continued revitalization of the downtown. Over the next 10 years, Jim and Ken worked with the city to implement the plan, which resulted in Franklin being named Indiana's best Main Street community in 2019. Voters selected Franklin because of the significant changes made to its downtown, bringing numerous new businesses to the area, including restaurants and shops, and also because through the streetscape and gateway enhancements, the downtown became walkable, resulting in more activities and festivals on the square. In 2004, Jim was nominated to the AIA College of Fellows. Fellowship is a membership category honoring individuals for their exceptional work and contributions to architecture and society. The AIA College of Fellows seeks to stimulate a sharing of interest among fellows, promote the purposes of AIA, advance the profession of architecture, mentor young architects, and be of ever-increasing service to society. Jim embodied these qualities. He advanced the profession of architecture by his involvement with not only his colleagues, but anyone he could talk to. Jason Shelley of AIA Indiana recalled that while members would come and go, Jim was always there. Shelley said, "He was a constant, steady, and informative presence when it came to any issue related to historic preservation." In the photo here, you can see him testifying in a state legislative committee. And he also lobbied at the State House on behalf of AIA Indiana on issues regarding historic preservation and housing. Jim also mentored all around him, as evidenced by the way he treated people. Jim said, "Always be straight with people and be engaging. Work to get the best out of people and share ideas." Jason Shelley said that Jim attended nearly every AIA meeting with a unique enthusiasm and willingness to share his expertise with other architects as an advocate for good design. He gave younger architects the trust and respect to work through design solutions, even though Jim might already know the answer. Jim's patience with this process allowed for a more meaningful training experience than a lecture from the boss. Jim served his community in several capacities. He served on the Central Indiana Regional Board for the American Red Cross and other boards, including Indiana Landmarks, Indiana German Heritage Society, Indiana Architectural Foundation, and Downtown Rotary Club. During his 25 years on the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, he championed the preservation of buildings and guided homeowners on solutions for their properties. In fact, his presence is still felt on the commission. At the August 7th, 2024 hearing, one of the commissioners mentioned, if Jim Kienle was here, he would be asking about the front facade. While I don't have a good photo of Jim's service, I like this one from the restoration of the Artcraft Theater marquee. On the left, you can see Jim right there on the job. In 2015, Jim was awarded AIA's Indiana's prestigious Gold Medal Award, the highest honor AIA Indiana bestows on an individual, for the work he did in preserving historic structures throughout the state. Although he had received numerous awards for his designs, this award was among his most cherished. He remarked that it was really quite overwhelming. It just means a great deal to me, not only because it's a great recognition, but it also recognizes the work that I've done with so many people throughout my career. The amount of talent I've worked with is really quite amazing, and there are just so many terrifically talented architects. Once again, Jim recognized that the field of architecture requires teamwork. Jim worked for Moody Nolan until 2017, and he still consulted for them as needed until he died. Jim's last project was on Union Station, and Marjorie said that he was heartbroken because it would be the only project he did not finish. This book represents much of Jim's work in Indianapolis. He was president of the Indiana Architectural Foundation, and he lent his vision and support to the idea of publishing this follow-up book to the Indianapolis Architecture Guide published in 1975 that I showed you previously. Jim said the face of downtown Indianapolis was transformed, and the development around the perimeter, it was a transformative thing. He was an important part of many of the buildings highlighted in this book. And his work also reached many other areas and people. I hope tonight you got a sense of who he was as an architect and some of the important projects of his career. I only had time to go through just a few of Jim's projects, so I'm sharing two collages of others that I didn't talk about while I share some of Jim's thoughts. On architecture, he said, we are translators. We're pulling things together, working through thorny issues that have to be resolved. And we're coming up with a solution that works within a budget, within a style, and we're working to make the community a better place than it was before. And his thoughts on preservation. One of the things that attracted me to preservation and adaptive reuse was being able to find new ways to use important structures and buildings that really define the identity of a place. I want to find ways to use these amazing structures and help move them to the next generation or the future. That's a really rewarding part of what I've been able to do for buildings and even downtowns all over the country. I'll end tonight with some of Jim's thoughts about Ewing Miller. I think they really apply to Jim himself. He would want to be remembered as someone who really cared about what he did. He really would like to be remembered as someone who encouraged the best in people. He loved to engage with people and see what they thought and apply it. He was just someone who cared about people. That's the best way to say it.